Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Bava Batra Daf Hey. We started our Mishna yesterday with a case of a person living one's courtyard, or not actually courtyard, one's field is surrounded by someone else's field, and the outer person puts up 4 walls for a fence around all the fields. Since the person in the middle is actually benefiting, they have to share in the cost. Remember, if it was just 3, no, once it's 4 and completely surrounded, they have to share in the costs. And then there was a debate, do they have to pay for whatever the person built the wall with, or do they have to pay for the cheapest possible version? Or even perhaps the cheapest way to go is just to pay for a guard, right? The minimum would be to have a guard watching the field. On that note, we're going to get into a story with Runia and Ravina, and Rava is the one who's going to rule. And then we're going to see a second story with Runia and Ravina with a different issue between them. But before we start with it, I want to remind you about 2 sugyot we saw with Runia already. I want you to kind of take these stories and get a vision of who Runia was and who Ravina was and what their relationship was. And maybe these stories will shed some light on our sugyot. So I'm going to start, and because we also have a short daf, it gives us a little bit of opportunity to have a little more time to go in depth into something. So on Bava Metzia Daf Kuftet, these are both sugyot near the end of Bava Metzia, so they should be somewhat fresh in your mind. Hopefully we'll refresh your memory. I put it in the chat for those who are in the Zoom. I can put it in again in case you missed it. I have them in Hebrew here. I didn't get the English, but anyway, I'm going to read them and explain. Runia was a shatala of Ravina. This is on Daf Kuftet, Amud Aleph. He was a planter for Ravina. So he worked for Ravina and planted in his field. Aksid and Salke. So he lost money wasn't the best, I guess he messed something up, lost money for him, and Ravina kicked him out. Ata l'kamei Rava, and Runia brings this case in front of Rava and says, Amar le chazimar my kavit, do you see what he did to me? He kicked me out just because I lost him some money. Amar le shapir avid, he said, actually, Runia did the right thing, Rava rules. Amar le halu itabi, but he didn't warn me. And then if you remember, if you didn't remember the story, you'll probably remember this. He says to him, oh, he didn't need to warn you. And that's because Rava holds that all these people don't need warning, right? Because they cause mistakes that can't be undone. And right, one is a teacher, one is a very memorable sugyot. Anyway, it's as if you're already forewarned. And that's story number 1. Story number 2 has nothing to do with Ravina. Story number 2 is that Ibu gave flax for Runia to watch. This is Bava Metzia Tzadi Gimel Amud Bet. And thieves came. I'm just going to loosely translate. Thieves came and stole the flax. They find the thief, but they come before Rav Nachman. Ibu brings Runia and says Runia was supposed to, watch it. He should pay. So they say, maybe this is based on some machloket. And anyway, they in the end say, Rava says, no, the reason here was that, interesting, Rava gets involved also here in the story, even though he wasn't the one who ruled. He says there were policemen or officers around, and I want you to pay attention to these words because they're going to come up in our sugya. If Runia had screamed, had said something, okay, they would have saved them he would have saved from the thieves coming. So in a sense, Runia theoretically shouldn't have been really responsible, but because he didn't scream out, he becomes responsible. He has to pay and go collect the money from the thieves himself. In other words, it's his responsibility to catch the thieves, bring them into court, get the money out of them, but he himself has to pay Ibu for what he did. And the main part I want you to remember is that he should have screamed. Because he didn't scream, gets him into trouble. First story. Runia, now we're getting to our daf. Runia akve Ravina me'arba ruchotav. Okay, so Ravina, again, surrounded him on all 4 walls, and akve meaning he put up a fence around all 4 walls. And now Runia is in the middle and gets protection. Amarle havli kama digadre. So Ravina goes to Runia and says, give me what I spent. Lo yavle. Runia does not agree to pay. Havli lafi kanim bezol. How about give me, for building a cheaper wall, a cheaper barrier? Lo yavle. Runia also doesn't agree to give him. Havli agarnitiruta. Okay, at least give me what it costs to pay for a shomer. Right? I see someone wrote in the chat, it was something I mentioned in yesterday's class, which is, it does seem weird that paying somebody to watch, a watchman, would actually cost less money, but apparently that does cost less money in those days. And lo yaivle, wasn't willing to pay. Well, the problem here is that Ravina, even though we kind of saw that Ravina can get Runia to pay, but perhaps we don't know why he doesn't go to court right away, but he comes up with a better plan. Now, the issue seems to be that Runia can claim, look, I don't want this. I don't need protection. What do I care? Let people come into my field. So Ravina comes up with a way that he's going to prove that Runia clearly wants the fence there. Once he can prove that, he has a much stronger claim in court, and then he'll bring him to court. So what does he do? Yom echad have a gadar dikle. So one day he sees that, okay, gadar is not to make a fence. He sees that he's picking dates. So he looks over, right? This is apropos hezek re'iyah. He looks into the field of Runia and sees Runia picking dates. Amar leila arisa. Now, again, it was a field. Fields don't have to be private. We already talked about you can look at someone's field, just not while everything's growing. Anyway, Amar leila arisa. So Ravina says to his aris, by the way, I want to point out here, okay, and this is going to come up later, which is that Runia worked as a planter for Ravina. So clearly they're not in the same socioeconomic sphere, okay? Runia was a planter. He worked in Ravina's field. Ravina has an aris, a sharecropper who he sends to do his work for him, okay? So we're going to already see that it seems clear that Ravina is more well-to-do than Runia, because Runia himself is picking his dates. So he says, Ravina says to his aris, go and steal some dates from his property. So he goes to bring it, and Rame Bekala. What does Runia do? What he didn't do in the other story, and he screams. Okay, so either he learned his lesson, and sometimes you need to scream, or maybe he was known that he screamed, and maybe that's all the more reason why they said, hey, why would you scream in this case and not the other case? Because in this case, it's the same situation. A thief is coming to steal something. But in this story, he's stealing Runya's stuff. In the Aihu story, he was stealing stuff that Runia was watching for someone else. So perhaps the contrast all of a sudden sheds light both on that story. I would say more on that story than on this story, right? That he did have the capability to scream when somebody comes in and steals from him. But there he didn't, because it wasn't his, and it showed lack of regard for someone else's property, perhaps. Anyway, I just think it's funny that both phrases come up exactly, the same thing, but the opposite. So anyway, he starts screaming, what are you doing? Stealing my dates. So comes Ravina and he says, Amarle, Galita data, demenach nichalach. You just proved that you clearly want the fence there because you don't want people coming and stealing your dates. And lo yehe Eliezer ba'alma, right? Forget about people coming in, but you certainly don't want goats coming in and stealing. And what's the fence going to protect from? Goats coming, right? So the fact that I put up a wall or a fence here is going to protect you from goats coming in. So you can't say that you're okay with goats coming into your field and stealing your dates if you're going to scream when a person comes in. Of course, you're going to be upset when goats come in. Milo ba'inati ruta, so don't you need protection? And therefore, pay up. Amarle, but Runia has a retort, and he says, easy ba'alma, lav lach luye baya. Ezim are very easy to get rid of. Okay, and some people have the word lav, some people don't. If you have the word lav, it's kind of said rhetorically. If not, it's just kind of said matter-of-factly, which is, easy ba'alma, lach luye baya. I can just scream and they'll leave. Again, the kind of screaming thing. But basically, if a goat comes in and I start saying, shoo, they'll get out of there. They'll listen right away. So I don't need a fence for that. I'll just stand there and I'll just shoo them away. So Amarle, here again, if you think about the socioeconomic, there's an interesting retort and perhaps not relevant to Runia, but he says to him, below gavra, but don't you need a person there to do it? In other words, what, you're going to stand there all day yourself? You're not going to stand there all day yourself, which means you have to bring in a guard and then at least pay me the least amount, which is a guard there, because if you need someone to shoo them away, that means you need a person there. Now, it could be that Runia claims, I would do it myself. Like, that's my job because I do things myself. And Ravina, you're a wealthy guy. You hire people to do things, but I don't hire people. I just do them myself. But you could say it's pretty unrealistic for the owner all the time to be standing there shooing away goats. They have other things to do on their fields. So in any case, although he was picking his own fruits, so they don't get anywhere. We're at a standstill. So what do you do when you're at a standstill? Ata l'kamei de Rava. So they bring it before Rava. What do? Can we insist that Ravina share in the costs of the fence, or at least share in the cost of a guard who would be shooing away the goats? So Amalei, Rava says, Zil faise b'maidi pais. He says to Runia, look, you got to give him what he asked for, okay? At least the minimum, the elo, and if you don't give him the minimum of the what it would cost you to put up a guard, da'anina, it's a weird way of writing it, but it means judge, like daninu, okay? Da'aninu lach dina ki Rav Huna aliba de Rabbi Yossi. And here Rava a little bit threatens him. I guess he was worried that Ravina wasn't really going to listen. And he said, listen, take his last suggestion and go with paying him for a guard. And if not, I'm going to rule for you, like Rav Huna said, in the name of the understanding of Rabbi Yossi, which was you have to pay you have to pay whatever that person put up. Then you'll have to share in the complete, right, half of whatever the fence actually cost Ravina. So take it, or I'll give you a worse option. And that's the end of the story. Second story, which seems really unrelated. This is going to be based on what we call dina de bar metzra. Dina de bar metzra means that and we're going to learn a lot about it in Bava Batra, if you have a field or a house, whatever it might be, and someone is selling the next door property, and even if they already sell it to someone, you have first dibs on getting that property. You can even take it out of the buyer's hands and say, here's your money, I'm buying it. Okay, I have top priority to buy this. And this is because of, as we learned many times in Bava Metzia, Vasita hayashar vatov b'nei Hashem, right? You have to do what's good and straight in the way of God, in the eyes of God, which means, right, who is going to benefit the most from having this land? The person who lives right adjacent to it. Because if they have to buy a field far away from their other fields, or a house far away, right, it's much less convenient. It's very convenient when people have another house that's right next door, or have fields that are near their other fields. So when they go to check on their fields and when they go to work on their fields, it's just much more convenient. So they have first priority to buy. So now we get to a story, and you wonder whether this story, because Runia and Ravina, we know already live next to each other, had fields next to each other. The question is this before they lived next to each other? It sort of depends on how we understand the end of the story. Or were they already living next to each other? Their fields were next to each other. We don't know. We'll see. Because the last 4 words of this section are subject to many different opinions, and which all affect how you read the story and what's going on. But I'll try to give you 2 when we get to the end. Runia Zavin Ara Metzra de Ravina. So Runia buys property right adjacent to Ravina's field. So perhaps this is why they ended up living near each other, and they weren't before. Sava Ravina Siluke, Mishum Dina de Bar Metzra. So Ravina said, oh, I'm going to kick him out, right? Because I want that land, and I have the rights to do that because of Dina de Bar Metzra. Amar le Rav Safra, Bureid Rav Yiva le Ravina. So in comes Rav Safra, and he says to Ravina, Amre inashe arba'a litzala, arba'a litzlala. People say 4 for the leather and 4 for the one. Okay, again, it's hard to translate this without getting already into Parshanut, because nobody really knows what this means. Some people say, I'll go with the first interpretation, 4 for the leather and 4 for the one who processes the leather. Okay, now what does this mean? So some people say Ravina was thank you for the tanner. Some people say Ravina was a shoemaker. I'm sorry, Runia was a shoemaker. And what he's saying is that Runia is poor. Why is Runia poor? Because Runia has to pay 4 zuzim for the leather, and then another 4 for the tanner to process it. So by the time he sells it, he's already spent so much money that he doesn't make a lot of profit. And you, which goes with our previous stories, you, Ravina, you're wealthy. Okay, what does this wealth have anything to do with anything? What does it have to do with Dina de Bar Metzra? So what Rav Safra is saying is something really brilliant, which is the whole purpose of Dina de Bar Metzra is Vasita Yashar Vatov. It's that Runia in our story is supposed to give in to Ravina and allow him to buy the property because it's more convenient for Ravina. And that's the right thing to do. But what Rav Safra is saying is, in this case, the right thing to do is not that. In other words, yes, Dina de Bar Metzra is a law, and it's there to protect you. and for Runia to do what's good in the eyes of God for you. But in this case, Runia is more in need than you are. He's poor and you're wealthy and you have a lot, and he doesn't. And if he wants this field, let him have the field, because we're reversing things here. And dina de bar metzra is overridden by something more important, which is help take care of people who are less, less wealthy than you are. So that's one way of reading it. Another way of reading it is there's nothing to do with whether Runia was poor or not, and whether asite yashar v'atov gets flipped, which I think is super fascinating, the fact that we could say, oh, well, that's because of asite yashar v'atov, so let's flip it on its head and say, well, in this case, the better thing to do, the right thing to do is something else, which makes a lot of sense, right? That you have to kind of see each situation for what it is. In any case, another option is to say Sala and Salala are not the leather and the tanner, but small piece and a big piece. Now, when you pay a tanner to process a piece of leather, it doesn't matter whether it's a small piece. It doesn't matter whether it's a large piece. Okay. Now, before we actually go to this explanation, I want to just go back to the previous. If we go with the previous explanation, perhaps this is the precursor to the story we had, because how did Runia get to be living right next to Ravina? From this story, right? They weren't living next to each other before. Now their fields are adjacent to each other, because Runia bought the field that really Ravina wanted. But according to, which in the end, by the way, ends up hurting Ravina, because he ends up putting this fence in and has to fight with Runia to get him to pay for it. According to the second version, what they're saying is, now, Runia and Ravina already had fields adjacent to each other. It's just that they were much more adjacent, that Runia had less fields adjacent and Ravina had more fields adjacent, because Ravina had all the fields in the area, around that area, and Runia was only next to it on one side. And basically, what Ravina was saying is, well, I'm next to it on more sides, and therefore I should have more rights to this field than Runia does. And the answer was no. It costs the same amount for, to tan a small piece. It costs the same amount to tan a large piece, meaning dina de bar metzra is the same whether you have one field right next to it or three fields adjacent. It doesn't matter how many or how big your fields are. It's all the same. If Runia bought it and he lives next door, he has rights to, he happened to have gotten to it first. So you can't take it away from him because of dina de bar metzra. And then it's just teaching us about dina de bar metzra, and not, it's just another story that happened because they happen to be adjacent to each other, their fields. So it's different ways of understanding it. There's actually a bunch more interpretations, but we'll stop with this. Okay, new Mishna. Kotel chatzer shenafal. We're back to our basic topic we're discussing. Two neighbors want to divide a courtyard. They put up a wall, and then the wall falls down. And now they want to rebuild it. So, mechayvin oto livnoto ad arba amot. We saw this Mishna already. It's quoted before in the Gemara. We insist that you build it only up to 4 cubits. If originally you decided to build an 8-cubit wall, and now you decided one side only wants to build it to 4 cubits, they can't afford that much anymore. So all they have to pay is for 4 cubits, because that's the minimum requirement measure for the height of this wall that's going to prevent hezek re'iyah, as we've been discussing. Now we're getting into a different issue, which is the main issue that's going to interest the Gemara, which is, after this wall is built, and then we get into an argument. Okay, we built a wall, we rebuilt a wall that had broken down between the two of us. We built it 4 cubits high, and then I claim that you didn't pay for your half. So we assume, since already, and we're going to get into this in the Gemara, already the time you should have paid had passed, because you should have paid right as we were building it, certainly by the time it was done. If I come the next day and say, hey, you didn't pay, and you say, what are you talking about? I already paid you. The burden of proof is on me to prove you haven't paid yet. Okay, that's what we assume you paid. Unless I can prove, I can bring witnesses that show, that say that you never paid me. Now, how you bring witnesses that say you never paid me, it's very complicated. So there's a big debate in the commentaries, how exactly we understand this, what exactly what you have to provide. I would have to provide, I would either have to provide witnesses who were with you the entire time that the wall was being built and saw that you didn't actually pay me the money. That seems pretty extreme to be able to bring that kind of testimony. Some people say it's that I would have to bring witnesses that I asked you to pay and you didn't. And that somehow, maybe at the time we finished the wall, when it was the time to pay, I asked you to pay and you said, no, I'm not willing to pay. And maybe that would be proof, but then how do we know you didn't pay after? So it's a little tricky, but What it really means is that you're believed. We assume you paid on time. Now we get to the second case, which we already kind of referenced, which is but higher than 4, I can't insist that you pay. If I want an 8-cubit wall like we had originally, I can't insist you pay for those extra 4 cubits. But if you built an 8-cubit wall in your property opposite this space, okay, not right next to it, like somewhere in the middle of your property, you built an 8-cubit wall, and your intent was to cover it, okay, to basically put a covering between the wall that I built that was 8 cubits high and your wall. So you now want to cover there. Even though you haven't yet put up the ceiling, it's going to go between the 8-cubit wall that I paid for and your 8-cubit wall, but it's obvious that that's what you're planning to do. Again, this is just like the previous Mishna. At that point, you have indicated that you want that 8-cubit wall there, and you want it 8 cubits high, because you obviously are not going to put a ceiling between a 4-cubit wall and an 8-cubit wall, and therefore you're benefiting from those extra 4 cubits. Then megalgalim alav kol. Then I can insist that you pay for everything. Everything obviously means half of everything. Okay, I can just insist that you share in the cost of the extra 4 cubits of the wall we built. But in this case, the chazaka works the other way. But in this case, since you didn't have to pay originally for the extra 4 cubits, we actually assume you don't pay until you can prove that you paid. So if we get into an argument and I say you didn't pay me for those extra 4 cubits and you say I did, I'm believed until you can provide proof that you actually paid me. That would be a little easier. You could bring witnesses that say, oh, well, we saw you actually pay. So now we're going to leave topic a little, although it's clearly connected. And we're going to talk about not a case of 2 people building a wall and a disagreement about did I pay you, did I not? Or did you pay me, did you not? But we're going to talk about a malve velove, okay? A classic example of someone who needs to pay someone back. I lent you money and you claim you already paid me back the money and I say no. Now, I would assume that we're talking about here where there was a loan that was oral, because if there was a written document, then we always say, okay, well, if the malva has the written document, then obviously it wasn't paid yet, because once the lova pays back the money, we rip up the shtar. But let's just assume it's an oral loan. Okay, so I lent you money in front of witnesses. I come back, I bring my witnesses who said, I lent you money. And you say, but I paid you back. And I say, okay, now the witnesses who claim, that there was a loan have no idea if you paid the money back or not. And you claim you paid me back. And I say, you did not. So now the debate becomes, at what point are we having this disagreement? So let's hakovei zman lechavero. I'm a Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish says hakovei zman lechavero. Okay, so if you set a date, let's say, right, we're in June now, so let's go with the date was August 1st. Okay, you said I set a date for the loan. You have to pay me back on August 1st. Va'amarlo pratich betoch zmani. And then I come mid-June and say, pay me back. And you said, I already paid you back. Eino ne'eman, you are not believed. And not only are you not believed, ulevai shifrad bismano. Okay, this is the problem of any collector, right? You should be happy if they pay on time, but nobody pays before the due date. So if you claim before the due date that you paid me, as long as we haven't gotten to August 1st, we assume you did not pay me back, because nobody pays their loans back before their time. People barely even pay their loans back on time, is what Reish Lakish is saying. So on time, yes, we can assume if the argument is on August 2nd and you say I already paid you yesterday, then we're going to believe you, because we assume, even though he said, halavai, we wish that people would pay on time, but then if you already claim you paid me back, you'll be believed. But if it's before the time, you're not going to be believed. And therefore, I can collect from you. Abaye and Rava disagree. And they say, the Amri Travayu, both of them say, Avid inish depara b'go zimne. People do sometimes pay before the due date. In fact, we'll explain to you why. Zimnin dimitramu lezuze. Sometimes you'll all of a sudden have some cash on hand. Amar easily para, and you say, you know what? I better pay my loan back. Turning out I'm a bet. I don't want to get into a big fight with you later, you say. Now, I don't want to have an issue with Michelle later. Let's say August 1st comes and it happens, today I have cash on June 30th. but I might not have cash on August 1st. And if the date comes and I don't have cash to pay you, you're going to say, I'm going to make a big deal for you. I'm going to take you to court. I'm going to sue you. I'm going to this. You don't want to get into all that. So you say, I have the cash now. Let me just pay my loan. Right? We all know there's people who wait for the last minute. And there's people who like to deal with things right when they can. As soon as they can deal with it, they deal with it, right? And there's people who, have things on your to-do list forever until the actual due date comes. So Abaye and Rava said, what do you mean? If I want to get money back from you, I have to prove it. If I can't prove it, right? It doesn't matter whether the date passed or didn't pass. If you claim you paid it, you're believed. So there's a big debate between them. What we're going to do now is take our Mishnah and the two parts of our Mishnah, and each part we're going to try to figure out. When we talk about the wall, the first part, okay, the wall was 4, and I claim you didn't pay your half. And what do we say? I'm not believed. At what point, though? Are we talking about within the time, not within the time? And they're going to suggest that this is going to raise a question for Reish Lakish, who said, again, we assume, this, by the way, is going to be called chazakah. There's a chazakah. That means there's an assumption we make about human behavior that people don't pay their loans on time. So same thing with the wall. Tanan. And then we're going to say this Mishnah seems to contradict that. Why? Let's see. It says in our Mishnah, b'chezkat shenatan ad sheviraya shalonatan. We always believe you that you paid for your half of the wall until we can prove otherwise when we're talking about, again, just the 4 cubits, the part that you're definitely going to have to pay. So, hey, chidami, what's the case? When are we having this argument? Before we finish building the wall? In the middle of building the wall? If it's that the time for the wall, we finish the wall is done. And then we start, I say, hey, you didn't pay me. And you said, what do you mean? I paid you when the wall was finished. Well, pshita, b'chezkat shenatan. We don't even need a Mishnah to tell you that. Everybody agrees with that. Everybody assumes that when there's a disagreement after the time of the loan, the burden of proof is on the creditor. So likewise here, if I spent the money on the wall and the wall is finished already, we obviously assume that you paid me back for the half because it's past the time of the loan. Again, not loan, but it's like that. It must be, because otherwise, why would the Mishnah even bother telling you this? It must be money that you said, oh, I paid you while we're in the middle of building the wall. And then what do you see here? Alma, therefore, since you're believed in this case, if we compare it to the loan case, we can say, Avid inish tapara begozimne. People do often pay before the due date comes. So they say, no, that's not true here. Again, this is not like a loan where the date of payment was August 1st. Not at all like that. If we started building the wall on June 30th and it was only done on August 1st, and you claim I paid you in the middle of July, kol shafa v'shafa zimnehu. Every time we finish a row, it's as if that was the time to pay. This isn't like a creditor borrower kind of thing, debtor case. This is a case where we're both together building a wall. I'm not going to build this wall unless you're paying me as we go. I'm not going to keep shelling out money for a joint wall. So every time we finish a row, before we move on, I make sure I get my money. So if you claim, or we assume that, so therefore you can claim, I already paid you halfway through, because halfway through is already, in this case, considered like the due date came up, because this is a different type of arrangement. So you can't learn anything from here against Reish Lakish. Now they're going to take the last case and say that the second case, where we actually don't believe you, Tashma, and this is going to raise a question on Abaye and Rava. Tashma, b'chezkat shelonatan, we assume you didn't pay, ad sheviraya shenatan. Now what's this case? This is the case where before we all agree about, but I wanted to build it to 8 and you didn't want to. Then you came along and built a wall that was 8 in your property. And then we assume that you're going to build a roof here between, a ceiling between both my wall that I built to 8 and your wall. And then we make you pay even before you put up the ceiling there. We already make you pay. And if I get into an argument with you later, I believe that you haven't paid me yet. So let's try to compare. So again, the Mishnah says, I'm going to be believed until you bring proof that you actually paid me for that extra part. Hechidami, what's the case? if the date already came, meaning you finished building the wall, and then you claim you didn't pay me. I'm sorry, you claimed you paid me and I claimed you didn't pay me yet. Why shouldn't you be believed? Everyone agrees. That's right. If we go to the creditor-debtor case, everyone agrees that if the debate is on August 2nd and you say I paid you on August 1st, you're definitely believed. So why wouldn't you be believed here if you already finished building your wall to 8 cubits high and we would assume you must have paid me? So why on earth wouldn't you be believed? So therefore it must be, and this is going to raise the difficulty with Abaye and Rava, lav da amarle peraticha b'toch zmani. It must be, right? You started building your wall. It's clear you're building an 8-cubit wall. You haven't finished it yet. And then you claimed, oh, but I already paid you then. Now, in this case, what do you see? Alma, the fact that I'm believed, therefore we can assume lo avid inish Farber goes imne. Why am I believed? If you claim I paid you when I was, the wall got to 6 cubits, because the assumption is that no, you wouldn't pay until you actually have to pay. And that's only going to be once your wall was 8 cubits high. And therefore you must have not paid me. And therefore it must be that people don't pay before they actually have to pay. And that goes against Abaye and Rava, who said, what do you mean? Sometimes they just happen to have the cash and they'll pay right away. So you would be believed. To which the Gemara answers, again, no, this is a totally different case. Shane hacha, but for a totally different reason than before. De amar miyemar de machayvu li Rabbanit. This is not as clear-cut a halacha. When we have to share the wall that fell in the 4-cubit wall, right, we obviously have to share it and you're obviously going to have to pay. And therefore, maybe one can assume, that if you're, let's say, Abaye and Rava, that you paid early, or in a creditor-debtor case, for sure you owe the money, you might pay early. But in this case, it's different. Why is it different? Because here, the wall was 4 cubits. That's what you had to pay for. I built it up to 8. You didn't have to pay. You start building another wall and you say, I'm building this other wall. You don't make an issue of it. You haven't yet put a roof on. It's not as clear as you might think that you're going to have to pay. And you might say, listen, me yammer, who's to say the machayv li Rabbanan? Maybe the rabbis won't make me pay. So it's so unlikely that you would have paid me until actually, according to this, it sounds like, until the court comes and says, you have to pay me for that 8-cubit wall because look, you just built a wall opposite it and you're obviously going to use my 8-cubit wall and you obviously showed you wanted it. So until you bring me to court and the rabbis actually say you have to pay, you might not think that you ever really need to pay. And therefore, you're certainly not going to pay a loan before it's time when it's not even clear you're going to have to pay. And you think maybe I could get away with not paying at all. So that would be more like this case. And that's why this doesn't raise a difficulty with Abaye and Rava, because Abaye and Rava would say, but in a case where it's clear you have to pay, you might actually pay before the time comes. So we tried to compare our Mishna and the 2 different parts of our Mishna in totally different ways to the Machloket Reish Lakish and Abaye and Rava and raise difficulties against each approach, but no comparison was successful, each for a different reason. Now we get to the Psak Halacha. Who do we hold like? Rav Papa v'Rav Huna b'reit Rav Yoshua avdei ka'Abaye v'Rava. So Rav Papa and Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yoshua, both agree like Abaye and Rava, which is strange because almost all sugyos we've seen sugyot like this, and we really do hold like Reish Lakish, and that's what we're going to see right now. Marbar v'ashi avi k'Reish Lakish v'hilchata k'Reish Lakish v'afilu miyatme. We'll get to the yatomim in a minute, but this is a principle we see across the board, and we're going to see it right now with the orphans, that we basically have an assumption. Chazaka that ein adam poreach chovot toch zmano. We don't worry about those type A personalities that want to pay everything right away up front. No, we assume in general that most people are going to push off payment and only pay it when they actually have to. And therefore, if there's any sort of disagreement before and there's no proof either which way, then if the disagreement happens before the payment was due, we assume the person didn't pay. Okay, so if there's a loan, we assume the loan was not paid back. And that's like Reish Lakish, and even from orphans. What does it mean even from orphans? Well, I'll read it in the Gemara and then we'll explain. Even though in general it was said, we learned this a lot of times, particularly in Gittin, but we learned it a whole bunch of other times as well. That orphans, if you want to get money out of orphans, there's always a concern that people will take advantage of orphans because they say, oh, your father owed us money. How did the orphans know what the father paid, what the father didn't pay? They'll have no way of knowing. The father's dead, can't testify, oh, I already paid that back. So if you want to get money out of orphans and say your father owed us money, you have to take an oath. Okay, anyone who wants to get money out of orphans needs to take an oath saying, I never got paid back, because we're worried that you're lying. So once you take an oath, we assume you're not going to lie under oath. But in this case, if the father died, okay, let's go back to our case, on June 20th, and the loan was due on August 1st, and the orphans say, well, maybe our father paid back, and all that, or maybe the court will say, no, we don't assume. We assumed, we hold so much like Reish Lakish, that in that case, if I was owed money by someone who died on June 30th, I could then go to the orphans and say, pay me back without having to take any sort of oath, because it's such a strong assumption that people don't pay their bills on time, right? And they don't return their money on time. They don't return their money before the time. Therefore, I'm believed. We assume it's a clear assumption that the father didn't pay, in which case you can go collect the money for the orphans without any sort of oath. Now we're going to ask the question, and we'll end with this question. We'll get to the answer tomorrow. Abaye lahu. Now they ask the following question. How strong is this chazaka? Is it strong enough to override Amali the Shakir? What's Amali the Shakir? Like amigo, remember? Amali the Shakir is, well, we assume you're telling the truth, because if you were lying, you would have a much better lie. So how does that interplay when you have a chazaka working against your claim? Okay, so that's what we're going to discuss right now. If, let's say, I go and I say, let's go back to our regular dates. On August 2nd, I come to you and I say, or let's say, I don't know, September 1st, let's just make it even easier. On September 1st, I come to you and say, hey, you owe me money on August 1st, you didn't pay me. And you come and say, now what's your best claim to say? I paid you on August 1st, right? We believe you if you said that, because that's what we've been talking about. Everybody agrees with that. But Amar lo, now this is all, by the way, this question is based on that we hold like Reish Lakish, that if it's within the time, we don't believe you. Remember, Abaye and Rava say even before the date, we believe you. So Amar lo, you come and say to me, Paratich b'toch zmani. You come and say, I paid you on June 30th. Mahu, what's the law? Mi amrina b'mkom chazaka amrina mali l'shaker, o dilma b'mkom chazaka lo amrina mali l'shaker. When you have a chazaka going against you, because your claim is a bad claim, basically. Why is your claim a bad claim? Because you're claiming you paid it before the due date, and nobody does that. So if we hold this chazaka is very strong, that nobody pays before their due date, then you have no claim. Your mali l'shaker doesn't work. Or if we say no, well, it's a bad claim, but since it's a bad claim, you could have had a much better claim. What's your better claim? You could have said, I paid you on August 1st. So if you were going to lie, why did you start with June 30th, right? You may as well have just said August 1st. So you must be telling the truth about June 30th, even though that goes against chazaka. So does a mali l'shaker work when your claim has a chazaka pulling against it and undermining it? Or do we say no, it's fine? Because you have a mali l'shaker, and that's stronger than chazaka. We've seen cases where like they ask rov and chazaka, which is stronger. We have, right, there's all different kinds of interplay. What happens here is there's halachic concepts, like we have a mali l'shaker, which basically can say, oh, well, if you're lying, you had a better lie, and therefore we believe you. We have a chazaka, which gives you either belief or not belief in certain cases, right? And then what happens when there's an interplay between the two? Or, sometimes we have it with rov and chazaka, because we have a chazaka, how we assume people will behave. And then there's also rov, like the majority of people this, and then sometimes there's a contradiction between the two, and which is stronger? So that's what we're doing here. We're taking concepts that they use to try to figure out what can we assume is the truth here, but sometimes they clash, and how do we relate to that? So that's the big question that we're going to have to figure out tomorrow. So review of our sugya. We started with the two stories of Runia, right? The first one, Runia and Ravina, with the fence around, and in the end, Runia had to pay the minimum of the guard, and that's because Runia caught him into proving that got him into a trap, proving that he actually did care that the area be guarded, and therefore Runia had to pay. And we had the second story of the bar metzra, though, that Runia bought the field, and perhaps because he was poor, or perhaps because even though we only have one field nearby, he had the laws of bar metzra over Ravina, who may have had more more fields nearby, right? Again, depending on how you understand it. Was it because Asita Yashar Vatov got uprooted here for a different Asita Yashar Vatov, which again is similar to the way we ended. We have different concepts that work together. Now, when they clash, how do we deal with it? And perhaps because Runia was poor, we let him stay there. Then we got to the Mishna about the 4 and then the 8. What if they want to build, the wall was 8, but it fell apart? We only obligate both sides to pay the 4. If one wants to build the 8, can't ask for money from the other side unless the other person again indicated that they really wanted the 8-cubit high wall, and that's if they build a wall in their own territory. And then we had the 2 cases, though, who's believed in which case. We compared it to Reish Lakish and Rav and Abaye's machloket about would people pay before the time of the loan coming up? Is that the same as our case? In the end, we proved no, it's not. Okay, either which way we look at it, you can't prove against one or the other. In the end, we say that we do hold like Reish Lakish, so we do have this chazaka, and then the question is, what if that chazaka comes in conflict with a mali l'shakir? Does the mali l'shakir work, or does the chazaka override the mali l'shakir? And that's what we left with, and we'll get back to this tomorrow. Wishing everyone a good day, hoping for good news, another complicated news weekend, and hoping for better news. Have a Shavua Tov, everybody.